Aboard the escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay, flagship of the task unit designated Taffy 3, the atmosphere was one of routine, almost tedious, efficiency. Rear Admiral Clifton Ziggy Sprague, a man whose features were permanently etched with the anxieties of command, was sipping what passed for coffee on the flag bridge. His world, at that moment, was a neat collection of maps, radiostatic, and status reports. The war, for him, was a problem of logistics and scheduling. Get the planes up to support the landings on Leyte. Keep the anti-submarine patrols flying. Protect the vulnerable troop transports. His fleet, Taffy 3, was a workman's outfit, a handful of slow, thin-skinned escort carriers and their tiny screen of destroyers and even smaller destroyer escorts. They were the sheepdogs, not the wolves. The wolves, Admiral Halsey's mighty Third Fleet with its fast carriers and Iowa-class battleships, were the official story of American power in the Pacific. They were the sledgehammer meant to crush any major Japanese threat. So when the first frantic report crackled over the radio from Ensign Bill Brooks, the pilot of an Avenger torpedo bomber, it didn't compute. It was an anomaly, a piece of data that simply didn't fit the machine. Enemy surface force of 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, and 11 destroyers sighted, closing on us at 30 knots. On Sprague's bridge, the initial reaction wasn't panic. It was annoyance. A collective, institutional disbelief. Imagine you're a traffic cop directing a school crossing, and someone calls in a report of a runaway freight train on your street. It's so far outside the realm of possibility that your first instinct is to question the sanity of the caller, not the reality of the train. Get that pilot's eyes checked, someone muttered. What's his position? Sprague demanded. He must be seeing Halsey's fleet. Has he got his recognition charts upside down? The plan, the beautiful, intricate plan laid out by the architects of the entire Pacific War, was a sacred text. And that text said, very clearly, that Admiral Kurita's center force, the very fleet the pilot was describing, had been mauled in the sea beyond sea 2 days prior. It was wounded, limping, and retreating. Halsey, the Wolfpack leader, had confirmed it before racing north to chase a decoy. The San Bernardino Strait, the very passage Kurita would need to use to reach them, was supposed to be a closed door, guarded by the ghosts of sunken Japanese ships. The official explanation wasn't just a theory, it was the foundation of their safety. The very reason Taffy 3 was sailing in these waters with its paper-thin hull exposed. They were there precisely because the danger was supposed to be gone. But the ghost on the radio wouldn't stay silent. Ensign Brooks came back on, his voice now tight with the kind of certainty that only comes when you are staring death in the face. I can see the pagoda masts, he squawked. I'm in the clouds, but I can see them. That one phrase, pagoda masts, was the key turning the lock. On the bridge of the Fanshawe Bay, a dozen minds flashed to the same silhouette charts they'd been forced to memorize. The tall, top-heavy, multi-tiered superstructures of Japanese capital ships. They looked like nothing else on Earth, least of all the clean, functional lines of an American battleship. The pilot wasn't mistaken. He wasn't misidentifying friendlies. He was describing the monster from the abyss. And then, before the full weight of that revelation could even settle, the sea itself screamed. It began with a sound no one in Taffy 3 was prepared for, a deep, guttural roar that seemed to tear the air apart, like a dozen express trains passing overhead simultaneously. Seconds later, the ocean erupted, not with the familiar gray-white plumes of explosions, but with something out of a nightmare kaleidoscope. A colossal geyser of water, dyed a shocking, brilliant pink, shot 100 feet into the air, just off the Fanshawe Bay's port bow. A moment later, another, this one a lurid green, bracketed its stern. Then yellow, then orange. The official explanation, the comforting logic of the high command, the entire strategic reality they had built their morning around, did not just crumble, it was vaporized in an instant by those impossible pillars of colored water. It was the calling card of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Their battleships used colored dyes in their shells to allow spotters to distinguish which salvo belonged to which ship. It was a signature as unique and as fatal as a fingerprint. They weren't just here. They weren't just passing by. They were dialing in their guns. On the bridge, Admiral Sprague looked through his binoculars at the horrifyingly close horizon. He could now see them himself, the menacing silhouettes, the flashes of their main batteries winking across the miles of water. The freight train was no longer a report. It was here, and it was bearing down on the school crossing. His voice, when he spoke to his staff, was stripped of all doubt, leaving only the cold, hollow certainty of doom. "Well, boys," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "that's the entire Japanese center force. And they're coming right for us." On the flag bridge of the Fanshawe Bay, those colored geysers weren't just terrifying, they were the punctuation marks on a death sentence. For Admiral Sprague, the battlefield was no longer the patch of ocean around his ships. It was the map table in his mind, and on that map, a colossal strategic disaster was unfolding with the brutal certainty of a collapsed building. This wasn't a random encounter. This was an assassination. And his tiny fleet, Taffy 3, wasn't the target. It was merely the gatekeeper, the flimsy wooden door the killers are about to kick down. To understand the sheer dread of that moment, you have to understand the anatomy of the invasion. Think of it as a bank heist. The prize, the gold in the vault, was Leyte Gulf. Inside sat hundreds of American ships, fat and slow and nearly defenseless transports carrying tens of thousands of soldiers, ammunition ships, fuel tankers. It was the logistical heart of General MacArthur's return to the Philippines. The entire campaign hinged on that fragile, beating heart. The vault door, the primary security, was meant to be Admiral William Bull Halsey's Third Fleet, a pantheon of naval gods, fast carriers, modern battleships, heavy cruisers. Its one job was to guard the approaches, to find and obliterate any Japanese fleet that dared come close. But the Japanese were brilliant chess players. They had dangled a decoy force of carriers far to the north, and Halsey, believing Kurita's center force was crippled, had taken the bait. He'd taken the entire vault door and charged off on a wild goose chase. Sprague and Taffy 3 were never meant to be security. They were the night watchmen, left behind to patrol the hallways, assuming the real guards were at their posts. Now, in the gray light of dawn, Sprague saw the terrible truth. The master thieves Kurita's battleships had picked the lock. They had slipped through the unguarded San Bernardino Strait, and the night watchmen, armed with pistols and flashlights, were the only thing standing between them and the vault. It was no longer a question of if his ships would be sunk. That was a mathematical certainty. The only question left was how many minutes, how many seconds, he could buy with their lives. Every moment his ships continued to exist, to fight, to draw fire, was another moment the helpless transports in Leyte Gulf had to scatter, another moment for a frantic call for help to reach the absentee Halsey. The survival of MacArthur's army rested on the shoulders of a handful of ships that were, by every metric of naval warfare, already dead. The radio net erupted into a cacophony of chaos. Sighting reports overlapped with panic calls for instructions. It was the pure, unadulterated sound of the fog of war descending. But on the bridge of one of those tiny destroyers, the USS Johnston, the fog was about to be pierced by a single, incandescent point of clarity. Commander Ernest Evans, a man of Cherokee ancestry with the hardened face of a warrior and a reputation for incandescent aggression, was not waiting for the Admiral's grand strategy. He didn't need a map to tell him what his duty was. He had a simple, brutal creed: a destroyer was an offensive weapon, and its purpose was to attack. He looked at the impossible odds, the giant shells splashing around his tiny ship, and he made a decision that was equal parts suicidal, insubordinate, and magnificent. Without a single order from Admiral Sprague, he grabbed the ship's intercom microphone. His voice cut through the mounting fear on his own bridge, a blade of pure, unhesitating command. "All hands, stand by for a torpedo attack." He turned to his helmsman, his eyes fixed not on his own fleet, but on the approaching line of Japanese cruisers. He was no longer a sheepdog. He was a lone wolf, turning to charge the entire pack. The time for planning was over. The time for surviving was over. The only time left was for fighting. He keyed his radio, broadcasting not to the Admiral, but to the other destroyers in his immediate vicinity, a de facto declaration of war against the entire Japanese Navy. He was a commander giving an order that no sane man would follow, and no sane enemy would ever expect. Aboard the USS Johnston, the world had compressed to the narrow confines of a steel bridge and the towering presence of the man in its center. Commander Ernest Evans was not thinking about the grand strategic picture. He wasn't thinking about Halsey or Leyte Gulf. He was a predator, and his entire universe was now focused on the hunt. The official plan had failed. Command structure was paralyzed by shock. In that vacuum, Evans acted. Left full rudder. Flank speed. He barked, and the 2,100-ton destroyer shuddered as her turbines spun up to their absolute limit, screaming like tortured animals. The ship heeled over hard, digging its port side into the sea and carving a sharp white crescent in the water. She was no longer steaming away from the enemy. She was turning back, turning towards them. From the bridges of the other American ships, the sight was utterly surreal. One tiny destroyer, a mere sliver of gray, peeling away from the meager safety of the group and accelerating towards a battle line that stretched for miles. On his own, without orders, Evans was initiating the first tactic available, laying a smoke screen. The Johnston began belching a thick, acrid, black cloud, a man-made squall designed to hide the lumbering carriers. It was a desperate, selfless act. To lay an effective screen, you had to sail between your friends and the enemy's guns, deliberately placing yourself in the crosshairs. The smoke wasn't a curtain, it was a target that screamed, "Here I am. Shoot at me." The Japanese obliged. The flagship of their cruiser squadron, the heavy cruiser Kumano, took the bait. Her 8-inch guns swiveled and locked onto the impudent American destroyer. Colored geysers, of venomous yellow, began to march across the water, straddling the charging Johnston. The roar of their passage was a physical concussion that vibrated through the deck plates. But Evans was a hunter closing on his prey. Through the smoke and the spray, he had his eye on a single prize, the Kumano. He was taking his ship closer, ever closer, into a range where his own weapons, so hopelessly outmatched at a distance, could finally speak. His 5-inch guns began to fire with frantic fury. Gunners slammed shells into the breaches, their movements a desperate, practiced ballet. This was the first clue for the Japanese, the first piece of data that didn't fit their own perfect plan. They had expected a rout, a simple execution of fleeing, terrified ships. They had not expected a counterattack from a single, suicidal destroyer. The sheer audacity of it was confusing. Was this a trap? A feint to draw them into hidden torpedoes? The fog of war was a two-way street, and the Johnston's insane charge had sown a seed of doubt. Evans didn't care. He was counting down the yards, his ship vibrating under the strain, shells splashing all around him. He was entering the kill zone, the knife-fighting range where a destroyer's ultimate weapon could finally be brought to bear. His torpedo officer was screaming ranges into his microphone, his voice tight with adrenaline. Range 10,000 yards. 9500. The Johnston was a wounded animal, bleeding smoke, but it was still charging. And in that moment, the fear on her decks began to recede, replaced by a kind of exhilarating, fatalistic clarity. The mystery of their fate was solved. They were going to die, but they were going to die fighting. And they were going to take one of the giants with them. The initial charge of the USS Johnston was a moment of pure, unadulterated shock and awe. On the Japanese flagship Yamato, Admiral Kurita's staff must have watched with a mixture of disbelief and contempt. It was a medieval knight charging a tank column. The courage was admirable, the outcome inevitable. Their plan was simple: crush the escort carriers, break through to Leyte, and annihilate the transports. This impudent destroyer was a footnote to be swatted aside. As the Johnston screamed towards the Kumano, her gun crews were performing miracles, firing at a rate that was physically impossible to maintain, their gun barrels glowing cherry red. They peppered the Kumano's superstructure with 5-inch shells, the equivalent of throwing rocks at a skyscraper. The shells sparked and ricocheted off the cruiser's thick armor, but it was infuriating, like the persistent sting of a wasp. The Kumano and the other ships in the Japanese finally stopped treating the Johnston as a curiosity and began to treat her as a threat. The full, terrifying weight of their attention now fell upon this one tiny ship. The sky around the Johnston filled with fire. It was no longer single salvos, but a continuous, rolling barrage from multiple cruisers and destroyers. The colored geysers became a solid wall of churning, explosive water. The sound was a single, deafening, world-ending roar. Evans's gamble, his hope for a clean torpedo run, was failing. The enemy wasn't confused, they were enraged. They were methodically, scientifically, exterminating a pest. Then, the inevitable happened. A shell from a Japanese destroyer, and then another, and another, found their mark. They tore through the Johnston's thin hull plating as if it were parchment. One slammed into the engine room, severing steam lines and instantly scalding men to death. The destroyer's speed, her greatest asset, was slashed in half. She began to slow, trailing a thick plume of white steam along with the black smoke, a gut-shot animal losing its strength. Another salvo hit the bridge. The concussion was biblical. Metal screamed and twisted. Men were thrown across the compartment like dolls. Commander Evans was slammed against a bulkhead, the blast tearing his shirt from his back and leaving him burned and bleeding. 2 of his fingers were sheared off. But the hit that mattered most was the one that destroyed the ship's gyro compass and fire control plotting room. Imagine trying to aim a rifle while spinning in circles. That was the Johnston's new reality. Without her gyro, the delicate, complex fire control computer that aimed her guns was useless. The nerve center of the ship's offensive capability was dead. The promising lead, the hope of a precision torpedo strike that had fueled their suicidal charge, had just turned into a dead end. They were now crippled, half-blind, and fighting with weapons that had been reduced to little more than muskets. The torpedo officer, his face a mask of desperation, screamed for a firing solution, but it was hopeless. They were inside 10,000 yards, the perfect range, but they couldn't guarantee a hit. The enemy's genius was the simple, overwhelming application of physics. They had more guns, bigger shells, and thicker armor. And now, they had landed the crippling blow. The hunter had become the prey. The Johnston was a floundering, bleeding wreck, surrounded by wolves who were just beginning to close in for the kill. The glorious charge had ended in a brutal, bloody reality check, plunging them from defiant hope back into the cold, dark certainty of annihilation. The USS Johnston was a dead ship floating. Her engine room was a Dantean hell of ruptured steam lines and dead men. Her advanced fire control was a wreck of severed wires. On her bridge, Commander Ernest Evans, bleeding from a dozen wounds, his left hand mangled, pushed himself upright. Through the haze of pain, he could see the Japanese cruisers tightening their ring around him. The plan had failed. The technology had failed. Hope was a casualty. By every rule in the book, the Johnston story was over. But this is where the story of war so often pivots. Not on grand strategies or perfect machines, but on the stubborn refusal of a few human beings to follow the script. The breakthrough came not from new technology, but from the resurrection of an old one. It came from a man, a voice, and a set of iron sights bolted to the side of a torpedo tube. Down on the main deck, the torpedo officer, Lieutenant Robert Hagen, was living his own nightmare. He had the 10 fish the Johnston's steel heart ready in their tubes, but his connection to the ship's electronic brain was severed. He was blind. Firing now would be a complete guess. But Commander Evans, his voice a raw, ragged bark, wasn't thinking about computers. He stumbled from the shattered bridge out onto the wing, clinging to a railing for support. He could see the torpedo mount directly below him. He could see Lieutenant Hagen looking up, his face a mask of desperate frustration. And he could see the lead Japanese cruiser, the Kumano, turning, presenting her broadside a perfect, arrogant target. In that moment, Evans abandoned the 20th century. He became a sea captain from the age of sail, directing a battle not with electronics, but with the sheer force of his will. He leaned over the railing, cupped his good hand to his mouth, and bellowed his orders down through the deafening roar of battle. "Hagen," he screamed, "aim for the lead cruiser. Use your sights." It was a preposterous order. The local sights on a torpedo tube were a primitive backup, a simple telescope and crosshairs. Using them to hit a moving target miles away, from a pitching, damaged ship, while under a relentless barrage, was like trying to shoot a clay pigeon with a musket from the back of a galloping horse. It was a 1-in-a-million shot. But it was an order. Hagen swung himself into the seat, pressed his eye to the rubber cup of the sight, and trained the heavy launcher on the distant silhouette of the Kumano. His world shrank to that one magnified image. He ignored the shells splashing around him, the screams of the wounded, the groaning of his own dying ship. He was a surgeon with a 10-ton scalpel. He watched the enemy's ship, felt the rhythm of his own vessel's pitch and roll, and led the target like a duck hunter, relying on nothing but instinct, experience, and a prayer. "Fire one," he yelled. A jolt ran through the deck as compressed air blasted the first torpedo from its tube. "Fire two. Fire three." One after another, The entire spread of 10 torpedoes leaped into the sea, their bronze propellers churning the water white as their engines ignited, racing towards the Japanese battle line. On the Johnston's bridge, and on the decks below, every man who could held his breath. They had thrown their last punch, a wild, desperate haymaker launched from a ship already on its knees. For a long, agonizing minute, there was nothing, just the endless, brutal hammering of enemy shells. And then, far across the water, it happened. A brilliant, silent flash of orange on the side of the Kumano. A heartbeat later, a massive column of black smoke erupted from the cruiser's bow, climbing hundreds of feet into the sky. One of the torpedoes had hit. The one-in-a-million shot had found its mark. The heavy cruiser, her bow nearly blown off, began to slow, smoke pouring from the wound. She fell out of the battle line, crippled and useless. The Johnston, with her last dying breath, had not just stung the wasp, she had torn its wing off. A new, more dangerous path had just been revealed. Even a dying ship, stripped of everything but courage, could still draw blood from the gods of war. The explosion that ripped the bow off the heavy cruiser Kumano was more than just a successful torpedo strike. It was a flare of defiance that illuminated a shocking, uncomfortable truth for both sides. For the Japanese, it was a moment of profound tactical dissonance. Their plan had been a clean, swift application of superior force against a weaker, fleeing enemy. But the enemy wasn't just fleeing. One small part of it had turned, charged, and, against all odds, landed a devastating blow. The Kumano falling out of formation was a snag in the beautiful, brutal fabric of their attack. It forced the other cruisers to maneuver, breaking the cohesion of their battle line. It was a moment of hesitation, and in a naval battle, hesitation is a poison. But the more profound truth was the one now dawning on the American side, specifically on the flag bridge of the USS Fanshawe Bay. Admiral Sprague, watching this unbelievable drama unfold, was trapped in a strategic paradox. He had followed the book, ordering a desperate, fighting retreat the only sane, logical course of action. But Ernest Evans and the Johnston had torn a page out of that book. They had charged without orders. They had engaged a superior force in a suicidal attack. And they had succeeded. The Johnston's lone wolf charge, followed moments later by similar, desperate attacks from the destroyers USS Hull and USS Harriman and the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, all inspired by Evans's initial, insane audacity, had done more to disrupt the Japanese attack in 10 minutes than Sprague's entire defensive strategy could have hoped to achieve in an hour. This was the uncomfortable truth: the official plan was failing. The chaos, the insubordination, the sheer, bloody-minded aggression of his destroyer captains was the only thing keeping his fleet alive. It revealed a catastrophic flaw not in the enemy, but in their own side's highest level of command. Where was Halsey? Why was the most powerful fleet on the planet absent? The success of the Johnston was a testament to the courage of its crew, but it was also a damning indictment of the strategic blunder that had left them in this impossible position. The real enemy in that moment wasn't just the Japanese fleet, it was the ghost of a flawed American plan, the arrogant belief that the enemy would do exactly what they were expected to do. On the crippled Johnston, this truth was felt in the most visceral way imaginable. Having fired her torpedoes, she was now effectively a gun platform with half its engines and no modern fire control. But Evans wasn't done. His ship was a wreck, but it could still shoot. He saw the other destroyers beginning their own torpedo runs and made another decision born of pure, distilled aggression. He would support them. He limped his ship back towards the fight, interposing the Johnston between the Japanese battle line and the charging USS Harriman. His gunners, now aiming by eye, opened fire on a target that dwarfed them, the Japanese battleship Congo. It was an act of pure, magnificent insanity. A 2,100-ton destroyer taking on a 36,000-ton fast battleship. A man with a pistol shooting at a tank to distract it from the man with the rocket launcher. And it worked. The Congo's massive secondary batteries, guns larger than the Johnston's main armament, turned their attention to this infuriating gnat that refused to die. Shells began to rain down on the Johnston once more, but for a few critical minutes, they were not firing at the Harriman, which was able to complete its own torpedo run. This was the new reality, the terrible and heroic lesson of the last 30 minutes. The only path to survival was through actions that guaranteed destruction. To save the fleet, you had to sacrifice the ship. The investigators at the heart of the storm had discovered the hidden, brutal truth of their situation. Victory would not be found in a clever plan, but in the willingness of individual captains to break the rules and drive their ships straight into the jaws of death. The desperate attacks by the destroyers had bought Admiral Sprague a few bloody minutes. But the horrifying arithmetic of the situation remained unchanged. The Japanese battle line, despite the disruption, was still overwhelmingly powerful and was relentlessly closing the distance to the American carriers. The uncomfortable truth that individual heroism was their only effective weapon was now being supplanted by an even grimmer reality. It wasn't enough. Sprague's radio operators were screaming into the void, broadcasting desperate, plain language calls for help. "We are engaged with the entire Japanese center force. Need immediate air support. Need battleship support. Repeat. Any American ship, send help." This is where the massive, intricate, supposedly infallible machinery of the U.S. Navy began to push back. The reports from Taffy 3 were so dire, so completely at odds with the known strategic picture, that they were met not with action, but with disbelief. Aboard the battleship USS New Jersey, Admiral Halsey's flagship far to the north, the first frantic messages from Taffy 3 were filtered through the dispassionate lens of a flag staff that had just committed the most powerful fleet in the world to what they believed was the decisive battle. They were chasing the Japanese decoy carriers. They had bought the lie, hook, line, and sinker. When Sprague's reports started coming in, the initial reaction was profound skepticism. Imagine a fire chief who has sent every engine to a confirmed 5-alarm blaze at a warehouse, only to get a call from a security guard claiming the city hall is on fire. His first instinct is that the guard is mistaken. He's hysterical. He's misidentifying a garbage fire. Halsey's staff, convinced that Kurita's center force was a broken remnant, began to question the reports with dismissive arrogance. "Is this authentic?" an officer asked. "Sprague's seeing ghosts," another likely concluded. "Tell him to check his charts. Kurita's running for home." The system was designed to process information and act on a coherent, agreed-upon reality. Taffy 3's reality was so radically different that the system treated it like a virus, an error in the code. Even worse was the signal that finally reached Admiral Nimitz, the Supreme Commander of the Pacific Fleet, in Hawaii. The message was garbled by the frantic process of encryption and decryption, and a meaningless padding phrase at the end the world wonders was accidentally left in. The message Nimitz read was from SyncPack Action Com 3rd Fleet Info Comanche CTF 77X, where is Task Force 34RR, the world wonders. To Nimitz, it read as a sarcastic rebuke. He fired back a sharp query to Halsey, demanding to know the location of his battleships. For Halsey, a man of immense pride, this message was a stinging insult. His focus was diverted, his temper frayed. The gears of the high command were grinding against each other, bogged down in miscommunication, disbelief, and ego, while men were dying off Samar. The system, which should have been a lifeline, was pushing back, questioning the very reality of the crisis. Sprague and his men were utterly, terrifyingly alone. They had presented the truth, written in the blood of their sailors, and the official response was a deafening, fatal silence. For the men of the USS Johnston, the silence from the high command was not an abstract problem. It was a death sentence delivered by the relentless thunder of incoming naval shells. After her torpedo run, the Johnston had become the focus of a special, vengeful hatred from the Japanese fleet. She was the ship that had drawn first blood, the ship that had refused to die, the insubordinate ghost that haunted their perfectly laid plans. Now, they were determined to exorcise her. Commander Ernest Evans, barely able to stand, his body a roadmap of burns and shrapnel wounds, was still in command. He had steered his crippled ship back into the fray, her 5-inch guns firing defiantly, but the end was coming with the mathematical certainty of a sunrise. A Japanese destroyer squadron, fast and lethal, closed in for the kill. They surrounded the Johnston, catching her in a merciless crossfire. Shells tore through her superstructure, knocking out her remaining guns one by one. Her last engine room was hit, and the ship, which had charged so defiantly into battle, finally lost all power and coasted to a dead, silent stop in the water. She was a floating coffin, adrift in a sea of fire. The final moments were a blur of horrific, intimate violence. Japanese shells, fired at point-blank range, ripped through the hull. Men were killed at their posts, in the passageways, in the aid stations. A shell hit the bridge again, killing more of the command staff and wounding Evans yet again. He was barely conscious, his vision blurred, but his will remained unbroken. The order to abandon ship was finally given. It was not a clean, orderly evacuation. Men, many of them horribly wounded, jumped from the decks into an ocean stained with oil and blood. They clung to debris, to life rafts, to anything that could float. Evans, refusing help, was last seen on the fantail, helping to push a damaged life raft into the water for his crew before disappearing into the churning sea. He had fulfilled his own creed, shouted into the intercom just hours before, "This is a fighting ship, and I will take her in harm's way." He had, and now harm's way had consumed them. The price of truth, the truth that a handful of destroyers could hold back a fleet. The truth that the American High Command had blundered was being paid in full. Of the Johnston's crew of 327 men, only 141 would survive. The USS Hull was sunk. The USS Samuel B. Roberts was sunk. The escort carrier USS Gamber Bay was sunk, the only American carrier in the war to be lost to surface gunfire. The pilots from Taffy 3's carriers, flying with fuel tanks on empty and sometimes with no ammunition at all, made strafing runs on Japanese battleships just to draw their anti-aircraft fire, a final act of suicidal defiance. This was the absolute bottom. The heroes who had seen the truth and acted upon it were now either dead or dying, scattered across miles of ocean. The disaster they had tried to prevent was now irrevocably in motion. The Japanese center force, though battered and confused by the ferocity of the tin cans, had finally punched through the screen. There was now nothing between Admiral Kurita's flagship, the super battleship Yamato, and the vulnerable heart of the American invasion fleet in Leyte Gulf. The sacrifice of the Johnston and her sister ships, it seemed, had been for nothing. The system had failed them, and now the wolf was finally, truly, inside the sheep pen. From the bridge of the Yamato, Admiral Kurita could practically taste his victory. All that was left was the slaughter. Aboard the bridge of the super battleship Yamato, the most powerful warship on the planet, Admiral Takeo Kurita was staring at the cusp of the greatest victory in the history of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The unfolding catastrophe for the Americans was, for him, the beautiful, brutal culmination of his strategy. He had endured heavy losses. He had navigated the treacherous San Bernardino Strait in darkness. He had weathered the insane, suicidal charges of the American destroyers. And he had succeeded. Taffy 3 was a shattered, burning ruin in his wake. His lookouts could see the smoke rising from Leyte Gulf just over the horizon. The prize was there for the taking. Hundreds of helpless transports waited for him like tethered goats. From the perspective of the men in the water, the survivors of the Johnston, the Hull, the Roberts, the scene was one of apocalyptic finality. They watched, with the hollow eyes of the defeated, as the pagoda masts of the Japanese fleet grew smaller, steaming inexorably towards their defenseless comrades in the Gulf. Every explosion they had witnessed, every friend they had lost, every act of impossible courage, now seemed like a footnote in a story of American defeat. Their sacrifice had been a speed bump, not a wall. The Japanese had paid a price in blood and confusion, but they had broken through. This is the moment where the official history, for decades, went silent. It became a story of Japanese victory snatched away at the last second, a mystery of command that baffled historians. Because what happened next defied all military logic. Just as his fleet was poised to deliver the killing blow, just as he was about to achieve a victory that could have dramatically altered the course of the war, Admiral Kurita did the unthinkable. He turned his fleet around. On the bridge of the Yamato, a fierce, internal battle was raging, one far more complex than the naval action that had just concluded. Kurita was a man operating in a profound, self-imposed fog of war. The reports he was receiving were a chaotic mess of contradictions. The sheer, unhinged ferocity of the American destroyer attacks had planted a seed of fatal doubt in his mind. No admiral, he reasoned, would sacrifice his destroyer screen in such a profligate, suicidal manner unless they were protecting something of immense value. He had been told he was facing nothing more than escort carriers. But the attacks felt like he had kicked a hornet's nest. They felt like the desperate, last-ditch defense of a full-sized American fast carrier fleet. His pilots were reporting sightings of carriers. His lookouts were reporting cruisers where there should be none. The constant, harassing attacks from the few planes Taffy 3 and her sister units could muster felt, to him, like the leading edge of a massive, coordinated air assault. He believed the destroyer charges were not acts of desperation, but a calculated screen to draw him into a trap, a massive ambush where Halsey's fleet, which he believed must be lurking just over the horizon, would fall upon him and annihilate him. The ignored warning, the suicidal courage of Ernest Evans and his fellow captains had, in the end, become the most powerful weapon of all. It was a message that Kurita had fatally misinterpreted. He saw the desperate courage of a few and mistook it for the calculated strategy of a multitude. He believed the lie his own plan was built on that Halsey was nearby and failed to recognize the greater truth that he was facing heroes, not tacticians. Convinced he was steaming into an overwhelming ambush, his own fleet battered, his communications in chaos, and his fuel running low, Kurita made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He gave the order to withdraw, to retreat back through the San Bernardino Strait. He snatched defeat from the jaws of a spectacular victory, not because of American firepower, but because of the ghost of American courage. For years, the story of the Battle off Samar was a paradox, a military ghost story. On paper, it was a catastrophic American intelligence failure, redeemed only by a baffling, almost miraculous Japanese blunder. The men of Taffy 3 were hailed as heroes, but the why of Kurita's turnaround remained a subject of intense debate. The official narrative was one of brave, but doomed men being saved by the enemy's inexplicable loss of nerve. The true, deeper story remained submerged, hidden in the silent archives of a defeated empire. The vindication for the men of the Johnston came decades later, piece by piece, as Japanese naval records were declassified, as battle reports were translated, and as the surviving officers of Kurita's center force began to tell their stories. The declassified file, in this case, wasn't a single document, but a mosaic of after-action reports, ship's logs, and personal testimonies from the other side. And when assembled, this mosaic revealed a stunning picture. We jump forward in time to a quiet study in the 1980s. An American naval historian is interviewing a retired Japanese naval officer, a man who was a young lieutenant on the bridge of the cruiser Tone during the battle. The old Japanese sailor, speaking through a translator, is calm, his memory sharp. He is asked, for the 100th time, the question that has echoed through the decades: why did Admiral Kurita turn back? The old man pauses, looking not at the historian, but at a point in the distant past. We were not fighting escort carriers, he says, his voice firm with a conviction forged in the crucible of that morning. We believed we were fighting Halsey's main fleet. The destroyers, they did not fight like escorts. They charged us like battleships. This was the key. This was the declassified truth that finally unlocked the entire mystery. The logs from the Yamato and other Japanese ships, when finally analyzed, showed a fleet descending into a state of profound tactical paranoia. Every hit from a 5-inch gun was magnified. Every torpedo wake was a potential submarine attack. The pilots of Taffy 3, making dummy runs with empty guns, were reported as full-scale dive bomber attacks. The chaos that Ernest Evans had sown was not just physical, it was psychological. They had hacked the enemy's decision-making process. The after-action report from the Japanese commander who sank the Johnston contained a passage of pure respect. He described the American destroyer's final moments, crippled and surrounded, yet still firing, as a display of fighting spirit that was beyond comprehension. The ghost of the Johnston, the sheer audacity of its fight against impossible odds, had created a fatal assumption in the Japanese collective mind. They had built an entire phantom American fleet out of the courage of a few tin cans. The vindication of Ernest Evans, who would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, was now complete. His seemingly suicidal charge was not a futile gesture. It was the single most effective act of psychological warfare in the entire battle. He had not been trying to sink the Japanese fleet, he had been trying to convince them they were in a fight they couldn't win. He had bluffed a royal flush with a pair of deuces, and the enemy, holding a winning hand, had folded. The final, declassified truth was not that Taffy 3 had been saved by a miracle. It was that they had manufactured their own miracle out of smoke, steel, and a quantity of raw, incandescent courage that the enemy's logic simply could not process. And so, the fog finally lifts. The seemingly chaotic, suicidal, and disparate actions of that morning off Samar snap into a single, coherent, and breathtaking picture. It's the moment where the battle ceases to be a story about ships and shells and becomes a profound lesson in the nature of war itself. The central mystery how the most lopsided naval mismatch of the war ended in an impossible American victory is finally solved. Think of it this way: Admiral Kurita and his staff were master chess players. They had executed a brilliant opening, sacrificing pieces to lure their opponent's Queen Halsey's fleet off the board. They had broken through his defenses and were now poised, with their own queen, the Yamato, to checkmate the helpless American king, the transport fleet, in Leyte Gulf. The game was over. All that remained was to knock the king over. But then, something impossible happened. A single American pawn, the USS Johnston, which should have been swept from the board, refused to die. Instead, it advanced. It charged straight at his queen. This was not a move in the game of chess. It was a violation of the game's fundamental logic. Then another pawn, the Hull, did the same. And another, the Samuel B. Roberts. They were not playing to win, they were playing to shatter the rules of the game itself. For Kurita, the chess master, this was profoundly unsettling. He looked at the board and could no longer understand the game he was playing. The suicidal aggression of these pawns convinced him that he must have missed something, that the opponent's queen must not have left the board after all, that a terrible trap was about to spring. And so, in the moment of his triumph, he picked up his own pieces and walked away from the table. Commander Ernest Evans was not a chess master. He was a warrior who understood a more ancient and brutal rule that when faced with certain death, the most powerful weapon you have is to infect your enemy with your own beautiful, terrifying, and glorious insanity. He didn't just command a destroyer, he weaponized courage. He and the men of Taffy 3 transformed their own tactical weakness into a strategic masterpiece of psychological warfare without ever intending to. They didn't just save the invasion of the Philippines. They demonstrated that